Well, the federal government will be hoping to hold the seat of Melbourne in the upcoming election, with the member, the well-regarded Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner, announcing his retirement. Mr Tanner's seat is a prime target for the Greens. They hope the government's shelving of its emissions trading scheme to deal with climate change may have bred disillusionment among traditional Labor voters. Since announcing his retirement last week, on the same day the Labor caucus replaced Kevin Rudd with Julia Gillard, Lindsay Tanner's kept a low profile. But to answer questions about his decision to leave, the change of Prime Minister and the contentious super profits tax, Mr Tanner joined me from Melbourne a short time ago. Lindsay Tanner, thanks for being with us.
Evening, Lee.
Let's start with the super profits tax. Are we going to see that issue resolved by the end of the week?
Oh, I'm in no position to say, Lee. I'm not directly involved in the negotiations. Our view all along has been that we'd like it resolved sooner rather than later, but of course in complex negotiations and discussions of this kind, your primary objective is always to get it right, and I've got no doubt that Wayne Swan and Martin Ferguson are still beavering away with that objective.
You're a senior government minister, though, in charge of finances. Are you getting any sense from your colleagues about how it's progressing?
Oh, look, we've obviously had some informal discussions, but very general, that are simply an indication of we are working away at it and hopeful of reaching a landing point, but that's about it, Lee, and I really am not directly involved, and so I'm not in a position to fill you in one way or the other, I'm afraid.
Based on what has been said publicly, though, is it safe for we, the public, to assume that the 40% rate across all commodities now won't be part of the final deal, given how firm the mining companies are in their opposition to that?
Oh, look, I can't give you any indication of whether or not there will be anything that people could describe as a deal, whether there will be a proposition that some people in the sector are comfortable with and others aren't, or whether we end up with something that the mining industry across the board doesn't agree with. Ultimately, these are decisions for government and for the Australian Parliament, Lee, and although we're very happy and have been from day one to discuss the detail, particularly some of the complex issues about the application of existing projects, for instance, we've always taken the view that ultimately we have the responsibility on behalf of the Australian people to take a position and to seek to legislate that position. So we're happy to engage in these processes of consultation and negotiation, but we are not backing away from our responsibility to the Australian people.
The mining industry says that if the matter's not resolved by the end of the week, that it will resume its advertising campaign. Is that sort of deadline pressure helpful?
Oh, look, they're entitled to take whatever view they like, Lee. We, as an act of good faith, decided to withdraw our advertising campaign, and that met with a positive response, but that's really a matter for them as to how they want to pursue discussions on these matters. You would expect that if they make that choice, that is a bit of a signal that things aren't going quite as well as people would hope, but let's wait until we get there to see what happens.
Given that Labor recently ditched a Prime Minister, have you given the mining companies the upper hand in this negotiation? Have you shown them the extent of your political desperation?
Well, first, I wouldn't describe it as political desperation, obviously. These things are always difficult and different people have different views on them. Reasonable people will have a different perspective, including from different parts of the country. But I think ultimately there's still an issue here, and it really doesn't matter who the key players are. There is still a big issue to be resolved for the future of our country, and we are committed to getting a fairer deal for the Australian people from the sale of their resources.
In hindsight, do you think it was a mistake for the government to not release the Henry tax review when you got it? Should you have had an open debate about all of the options and then released your policies, rather than hold the review close until your policy settings were all ready to go?
A number of people have put that kind of proposition to me over the last few weeks, Lee, and I've always said that although it's the kind of thing that sounds in theory appropriate, in practice what would have happened would have been that the moment we don't rule out this proposal, it becomes the government's proposal. We are effectively in the same position as we were on May the 2nd when we announced our intention to proceed with that proposal. So although in theory I can understand why people are expressing that view, I think in practice it would have made no difference.
But how do you then ever commission a review on something if the findings of that review can't come out and be open for discussion because of the sort of factors that you just mentioned?
Well, because it happens in one instance doesn't mean that it's always going to happen. I'd remind you that there was something around 130 different recommendations of the Henry Review, and we did rule out a number. We indicated a variety of others were predominantly matters for state governments, and we didn't want to override them on those issues. And again, there was a list of quite a substantial number of proposals that we didn't indicate we were going to adopt, but we weren't ruling out, and we believed are open for subsequent discussion. So there's a bit of a horses for courses question here of actually making a decision how to deal with a particular proposition on its merits, and that'll vary according to what the issue is.
The mining tax is one of the things that's blamed for Kevin Rudd's downfall. Can I ask, are you comfortable with the way that the Prime Minister was ousted?
There's only one reason that any of us are members of Parliament, Lee. I said this in my speech to the House indicating I was not returning, and that is that when we front up to an election, there are about 100,000 odd ballot papers out there in our electorates with our names and the words Australian Labor Party underneath those names. That's why I've been a Member of Parliament for 17 years. I've had the words Australian Labor Party after my name on the ballot paper, and that's why anybody else, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, all the rest of us, that's why we've been in Parliament. That means we sign up to collective decision making, and it means that sometimes decisions occur that we agree with and sometimes they don't, and when you have ballots, by definition there'll be a winner and a loser, but ultimately you've got a process here. It's a democratic process. It can be very tough, it can be bruising, but it is a democratic process, and always, win, lose or draw, you have to abide by the outcome and get on with the business, and that's what people in the government are doing.
So are you saying that what happened to Kevin Rudd then is just part and parcel of the way politics is done?
I've been in the game for 17 years in the Parliament, and prior to that, of course, I've been very active in Labor politics since I was a teenager. I've seen lots of tough things happen. I've seen people go through some awful battles. I've seen people really hurt by political combat. It is the nature of the game. It's, a bit like football. Sometimes you get injured. And in politics, it's a tough game. And we all sign up to it knowing that sometimes things aren't going to quite go as we hope, that we'll get great highs, great opportunities, but we will also from time to time suffer great lows, great defeats and some demoralisation. That is just the nature of the game, and it's really a wrong way of looking at it to pull out one particular example and say, oh, isn't this terrible? Democracy is a contact sport, and it always will be that way, and the great thing is that it's the alternative to violence for settling disputes, for settling contests about issues and interests.
None of that actually answers, though, whether you are comfortable with the way that Kevin Rudd was ousted.
Well, my answer is that I'm comfortable with the Labor Party making majority decisions about its leadership and all the other issues that it has to deal with, and sometimes my view prevails, sometimes it doesn't. I've been on the losing side in ballots, I've been on the winning side in ballots.
Were you on the losing side in this one?
Well, I'm not going to give any commentary about my views about the particular contest that occurred here, but I'm always comfortable with being part of those processes.
Do you think that Labor could suffer any sort of backlash from voters who feel that the way Kevin Rudd was ousted was ruthless and unfair?
To be honest, I don't know. I've got no doubt that there are always going to be some voters out there who will have a different point of view from what the majority view of the Labor Party was. That's just the nature of things. There's always going to be divergent views in the community. It is conceivable that will occur. I'm not in a position to judge, but all we can do, having made the decision, is to get on with the business of governing Australia in the interest of the Australian people, of building long-term sustainable growth in the economy, of developing an agenda for our second term if we are elected to government, and